Wisdom, the first emanation of En Sof, the protogonos, the hypostasis, the Adam Kadmon of the Kabbalist, the Brahma of the Hindu, the Logos of Plato, and the beginning of St. John is the Rasit of the book of Genesis. If rightly interpreted, it overturns, as we've remarked, the whole elaborate system of Christian theology, for it proves that behind the creative deity there was a higher God, a planner, an architect, and that the former was but his executive agent, a simple power. But if the Gnostics were destroyed, the Gnosis, based on the secret science of sciences, still lives. It is the earth which helps the woman and which is destined to open her mouth to swallow up medieval Christianity. The usurper and assassin of the great master's doctrine. The ancient Kabbalah, the Gnosis, or traditional secret knowledge, was never without its representatives in any age or country. The trinities of initiates, whether passed into history or concealed under the impenetrable veil of mystery, are preserved and impressed throughout the ages. They are known as Moses, Aholiab, and Bezaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, as Plato, Philo, and Pythagoras, etc. At the Transfiguration, we see them as Jesus, Moses, and Elias, and the three Trismegistai, and three Kabbalists, Peter, James, and John, whose revelation is the key to all wisdom. We found them in the twilight of Jewish history as Zoroaster, Abraham, and Terah, and later as Enoch, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The holy primitive syllable composed of the three letters A-U-M, in which is contained the Vedic Trimurti, Trinity, must be kept secret like another triple Veda, says Manu in Book 11, Sloka 265. Swayambhuva is the unrevealed deity. It is the being existent through and of itself. He is the central and immortal germ of all that exists in the universe. Three trinities emanate and are confounded in him, forming a supreme unity. These trinities, or the triple trimurti, are the Nara, Nari, and Viraji, the initial triad, the Agni, Vaya, and Surya, the manifested triad, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the creative triad. Each of these triads becomes less metaphysical and more adapted to the vulgar intelligence as it descends. Thus, the last becomes but the symbol in its concrete expression, the necessarianism of a purely metaphysical conception. Together with Swayambhuva, they are the 10 Sephiroth of the Hebrew Kabbalists, the 10 Hindu Prashapatis, the Ein Sof of the former answering of the great unknown, expressed by the mystic A-U-M of the latter. Truly, the fate of many a future generation hung on a gossamer thread in the days of the 3rd and 4th centuries, had not the emperor sent in 389 to Alexandria a rescript which was forced from him by the Christians. For the destruction of every idol, our own century would never have had a Christian mythological pantheon of its own. Never did the Neoplatonic school reach such a height of philosophy as when nearest its end. Uniting the mystic theosophy of old Egypt with the refined philosophy of the Greeks, nearer to the ancient mysteries of Thebes and Memphis than they had been for centuries, versed in the science of soothsaying and divination, as in the art of the therapeutists, friendly with the acutest men of the Jewish nation who were deeply imbued with the Zoroastrian ideas. The Neoplatonists tended to amalgamate the old wisdom of the Oriental Kabbalah with the more refined conceptions of the Occidental theosophists. Notwithstanding the treason of the Christians who saw fit for political reasons after the days of Constantine to repudiate their tutors, the influence of the New Platonic philosophy is conspicuous in the subsequent adoption of dogmas, the origin of which can be traced but too easily to that remarkable school. Though mutilated and disfigured, they still preserve a strong family likeness which nothing can obliterate. But if the knowledge of the occult powers of nature opens the spiritual sight of man, enlarges his intellectual faculties, and leads him unerringly to a profounder veneration for their Creator, on the other hand, ignorance, dogmatic narrow-mindedness, and a childish fear of looking to the bottom of things invariably leads to fetish worship and superstition. When Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, had openly embraced the cause of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, and had anthropomorphized her into Mary, the Mother of God, and the Trinitarian controversy had taken place. From that moment, the Egyptian doctrine of the emanation of the creative God out of Emeth began to be tortured in 1,000 ways until the councils had agreed upon the adoption of it as it now stands, the disfigured ternary of the Kabbalistic Solomon and Philo. But as its origin was yet too evident, the Word was no longer called the heavenly man, the primal Adam Kadmon, but became the Logos, Christ, and was made as old as the Ancient of the Ancient, his Father. The concealed wisdom became identical with its emanation, the divine thought, and made to be regarded co-equal and co-eternal with its first manifestation. Nor does the mystery of the Eucharist pertain to Christians alone. Godfrey Higgins proves that it was instituted many hundreds of years before the Paschal Supper, and says that the sacrifice of bread and wine was common to many ancient nations. Cicero mentions it in his works and wonders at the strangeness of the rite. There had been an esoteric meaning attached to it from the first establishment of the mysteries, and the Eucharistia is one of the oldest rites of antiquity. With the Hierophants, it had nearly the same significance as with the Christians. Ceres was bread and Bacchus was wine. The former meaning regeneration of life from the seed, and the latter, the grape, the emblem of wisdom and knowledge, the accumulation of the spirit of things, and the fermentation and subsequent strength of that esoteric knowledge being justly symbolized by wine. The mystery related to the dramas of Eden, it is said to have been first taught by Janus, who was also the first to introduce in the temples the sacrifices of bread and wine in commemoration of the fall into generation as the symbol of the seed. I am the vine, and my Father is the husbandman, says Jesus, alluding to the secret knowledge that could be imparted by him. I will drink no more of the fruit of the vine until that day that I drink it new in the kingdom of God. The festival of the Eleusinian mysteries began in the month of Bodrimion, which corresponds with the month of September, the time of grape gathering, and lasted from the 15th to the 22nd of the month, 7 days. The Hebrew festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, began on the 15th and ended on the 22nd of the month of Ethanim, which Dunlap shows is derived from Adonim, Adonia, Atenim. Ethanim, and this feast is named in Exodus 23:16, the Feast of Ingatherings. All the men of Israel assembled unto King Solomon at the feast in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th. Plutarch thinks the Feast of the Booths to be the Bacchic rites, not the Eleusinian. Thus, Bacchus was directly called upon, he says. The Sabazian worship was sabbatic. The names Evius or Hevius and Luaus are identical with Hivite and Levite. The French name Louis or Louis is the Hebrew Levi or Levi. Iacchus again is Iao or Jehovah, and Baal or Adon, like Bacchus, was a phallic god. Who shall ascend into the hill, the high place of the Lord? Asks the holy King David. Who shall stand in the place of his Kadushu? Psalms 24:3. Kadesh may mean, in one sense, to devote, hallow, sanctify, and even to initiate or to set apart, but it also means the ministers of lascivious rites, the Venus worship. And the true interpretation of the word Kadesh is bluntly rendered in Deuteronomy 23:17, Hosea 4:14, and Genesis 28 from verses 15 to 22. The holy Kadeshuth of the Bible were identical as to the duties of their office with the Nautch girls of the later Hindu pagodas. The Hebrew Kadeshim or Galai lived by the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the grove, or bust of Venus Astarte, says verse the 7th in the 23rd chapter of 2 Kings. But a still earlier origin than the Egyptian and Chaldean can be assigned to the Virgin Mother of God, Queen of Heaven. Though Isis is also by right the Queen of Heaven and is generally represented carrying in her hand the crux and sata composed of the mundane cross and the storos of the Gnostics, she is a great deal younger than the celestial virgin, Neith. Ancient as may be the origin of Hermes, lost in the unknown days of Egyptian colonization, there is yet a far older prophecy, directly relating to the Hindu Krishna, according to the Brahmins. The Mexicans call the father of their trinity Izona, the son Bacab, and the Holy Ghost Ekva, and say they received it, the doctrine, from their ancestors. About the time of the Reformation, the study of alchemy and magic had become so prevalent among the clergy as to produce great scandal. Cardinal Wolsey was openly accused before the court in the Privy Council of Confederacy with a man named Wood, a sorcerer, who said that my Lord Cardinal had such a range that whatsoever he asked of that king's grace that he had it, adding that Master Cromwell, when he was servant in my Lord Cardinal's house, read many books, and especially the books of Solomon, and studied metals and what virtues they had after the canon of Solomon. This case, with several others equally curious, it is to be found among the Cromwell papers in the record office of the Rolls House. Luther speaks of a fish pond at Rome, situated near a convent of nuns, which, having been cleared out by order of Pope Gregory, disclosed at the bottom over 6,000 infant skulls, and of a nunnery at Nürnberg in Austria, whose foundations, when searched, disclosed the same relics of celibacy and chastity. Under this Christian standard, the brief space of 14 years, Tomás de Torquemada, the confessor of Queen Isabella, burned over 10,000 persons and sentenced to the torture 80,000 more. Granger tells the story, describing it as having occurred in his time. The poor animal had been taught to tell the spots upon cards in the hour of the day by the watch. Horse and owner were both indicted by the sacred office for dealing with the devil, and both were burned with a great ceremony of auto da fe at Lisbon in 1601 as wizards. Nowhere during the Middle Ages were the arts of magic and sorcery more practiced by the clergy than in Spain and Portugal. The book of Dr. W.G. Solden of Stuttgart has become as famous in Germany as Boden's book on demonomania in France. It is the most complete German treatise on witchcraft of the 16th century. Did this butchery in the name of their Moloch god prevent these treasure hunters from resorting to the black arts themselves? Not in the least, for in no class were such consulters of familiar spirits more numerous than among the clergy during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The story of the Prince Radziwill is well known. It was the undeniable deception of the monks and nuns surrounding him and his own confessor which made the Polish nobleman become a Lutheran. We might fill volumes with proofs of undeniable confederacy between the exorcisers and the demons. Their very nature betrays them. Instead of being independent, crafty entities bent on the destruction of men's souls and spirits, the majority of them are simply the elementals of the Kabbalists, creatures with no intellect of their own, but faithful mirrors of the will, which evokes, controls, and guides them. We will not waste our time in drawing the reader's attention to doubtful or obscure thaumaturgists and exorcisers, but take as our standard one of the greatest saints of Catholicism, and select a bouquet from the same prolific conservatory of pious lies, the golden legend of James de Voragine. These two anecdotes, chosen at random from among hundreds, if rivaled or not surpassed, by the wildest romances of the pagan thaumaturgists, magicians, and spiritualists. And yet, when Pythagoras is said to have subdued animals, even wild beasts, merely through a powerful mesmeric influence, he is pronounced by one half of the Catholics a barefaced impostor, and by the rest a sorcerer who worked magic in confederacy with the devil. Neither the she-bear nor the eagle, nor yet the bull that Pythagoras is said to have persuaded to give up eating beans were alleged to have answered with human voices, while St. Benedict's black raven, whom he called brother, argues with him and croaks his answers like a born casuist. When the saint offers him one half of a poisoned loaf, the raven grows indignant and reproaches him in Latin as though he had just graduated at the propaganda. If it be objected that the Golden Legend is now but half supported by the Church, and that it is known to have been compiled by the writer from a collection of the lives of the saints, for the most part unauthenticated, we can show that, at least in one instance, the biography is no legendary compilation, but the history of one man. by another one who was his contemporary. Jordan and Gibbon demonstrated years ago that the early fathers used to select narratives wherewith to ornament the lives of their apocryphal saints, from Ovid, Homer, Livy, and even from the unwritten popular legends of pagan nations. But such is not the case in the above instances. Saint Bernard lived in the 12th century, and Saint Dominic was nearly contemporaneous with the author of the Golden Legend. De Vorgine died in 1298, and Dominic, whose exorcisms and life he describes so minutely, instituted his order in the first quarter of the 13th century. Moreover, de Vorgine was vicar general of the Dominicans himself in the middle of the same century, and therefore described the miracles wrought by his hero and patron but a few years after they were alleged to have happened. He wrote them in the same convent, and while narrating these wonders, he had probably 50 persons at hand who had been eyewitnesses to the saint's mode of living. What must we think in such a case of a biographer who seriously describes the following? One day, as the blessed saint was occupied in his study, the devil began pestering him in the shape of a flea. He frisked and jumped about the pages of his book until the harassed saint, unwilling as he was to act unkindly, even toward a devil, felt compelled to punish him by fixing the troublesome devil on the very sentence on which he stopped, by clasping the book. At another time, the same devil appeared under the shape of a monkey. He grinned so horribly that Dominic, in order to get rid of him, ordered the devil monkey to take the candle and hold it for him until he had done reading. The poor imp did so, and held it until it was consumed to the very end of the wick, and notwithstanding his pitiful cries for mercy, the saint compelled him to hold it till his fingers were burned to the bones. Enough! The approbation with which this book was received by the church, and peculiar sanctity attributed to it, is sufficient to show the estimation in which veracity was held by its patrons. We may add in conclusion that the finest quintessence of Boccaccio's Decameron appears prudery itself by comparison with the filthy realism of the Golden Legend. When a religion which compelled David to cut off and deliver 200 foreskins of his enemies before he could become the king's son-in-law, 1 Samuel chapter 18, is accepted as a standard by Christians, they would do well not to cast into the teeth of heathen the impudicities of their faiths. Only those directly interested in the deception have had the opportunity to compare the rituals of the church and the magicians. The best Latin scholars were, until a comparatively recent date, either churchmen or dependent upon the church. Long before the sign of the cross was adopted as a Christian symbol, it was employed as a secret sign of recognition among neophytes and adepts. Here the author quotes an author she names as Draper. No one did more than this father to bring science and religion into antagonism. It was mainly he who diverted the Bible from its true office, a guide to purity of life, and placed it in the perilous position of being the arbiter of human knowledge and audacious tyranny over the mind of man. Talking about Saint Augustine. If Simon Magus, the most problematical of all in an historical sense, ever existed otherwise than in the overheated fancy of Peter and the other apostles, he was evidently no worse than any of his adversaries. The erudite author of Supernatural Religion assiduously endeavors to prove that by Simon Magus we must understand the Apostle Paul. Paul had been partially, at least if not completely, initiated into the theurgic mysteries. The apostle had his head shorn at Cenchrea, where Lucius Apulcius was initiated, and the Nazars were a class of Chaldean theurgists. Paul declares that, according to the grace of God which is given unto me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation. This expression, master builder, used only once in the whole Bible and by Paul, may be considered as a whole revelation. As to Peter, biblical criticism has shown before now that he had probably no more to do with the foundation of the Latin Church at Rome than to furnish it the pretext so readily seized upon by the cunning Irenaeus to benefit this church with the new name of the apostle, Petra or Kepha, a name which allowed so readily by an easy play upon words to connect it with Petroma, the double set of stone tablets used by the Hierophant at the initiations during the final mystery. In this, perhaps, lies concealed the whole secret of the claims of the Vatican. As Professor Wilder happily suggests, in the Oriental countries, the designation Peter, in Phoenician and Chaldaic and interpreter, appears to have been the title of this personage, the Hierophant. There is in these facts some reminder of the peculiar circumstances of the Mosaic Law, and also of the claim of the Pope to be the successor of Peter, the Hierophant or interpreter of the Christian religion. This word, Peter, here spelled simply P-T-R, was partially interpreted, owing to another word similarly written in another group of hieroglyphics on a stela, the sign used for it being an opened eye. Bunsen mentioned as another explanation of Peter, to show. It appears to me, he remarks, that our Peter is literally the old Aramaic and Hebrew patar. But whether the illuminator of the Greco-Demotic manuscript is identical with Jesus or not, the fact remains that we find him selecting a mystery appellation for one who is made to appear later by the Catholic Church as the janitor of the kingdom of heaven and the interpreter of Christ's will. The word patar or Peter locates both master and disciple in the circle of initiation and connects them with the secret doctrine. The great Hierophant of the ancient mysteries never allowed the candidates to see or hear him personally. He was the presiding but invisible deity, uttering his will and instructions through a second party. And 2,000 years later, we discovered that the Dalai Lamas of Tibet had been following for centuries the same traditional program during the most important religious mysteries of Lamaism. If Jesus knew the secret meaning of the title bestowed by him on Simon, then he must have been initiated. Otherwise, he could not have learned it. And if he was an initiate of either the Pythagorean Essenes, the Chaldean Magi, or the Egyptian priests, then the doctrine taught by him was but a portion of the secret doctrine taught by the pagan Hierophants to the few select adepts admitted within the sacred Advaita. Immaculate is Our Lady Isis, is the legend around an engraving of Serapis and Isis. The very terms applied afterwards to that personage, the Virgin Mary, who succeeded to her form, titles, symbols, rites, and ceremonies. Thus her devotees carried into the new priesthood the former badges of their profession, the obligation to celibacy, the tonsure, and the surplice, omitting, unfortunately, the frequent ablutions prescribed by the ancient creed. The black virgins, so highly reverenced in certain French cathedrals, proved, when at last critically examined, basalt figures of Isis. We thus see that the bells used by Christians come to them directly from the Buddhists, Tibetans, and Chinese. The beads and rosaries have the same origin and have been used by Buddhist monks for over 2,300 years. The lingams in the Hindu temples are ornamented upon certain days with large berries from a tree sacred to Mahadeva, which are strung into rosaries. The title of nun is an Egyptian word and had with them the actual meaning. The Christians did not even take the trouble of translating the word nona. The aureole of the saints was used by the antediluvian artists of Babylonia whenever they desired to honor or deify a mortal's head. In a celebrated picture in Moore's Hindu pantheon entitled Krishna Nursed by Devaki from a highly finished picture, the Hindu virgin is represented as seated on a lounge and nursing Krishna. The hair brushed back, the long veil, and the golden aureole around the virgin's head, as well as around that of the Hindu savior, are striking. No Catholic, well versed as he might be in the mysterious symbolism of iconology, would hesitate for a moment to worship at that shrine the Virgin Mary, the mother of his God. In Indur Subha, the south entrance of the caves of Ellora, may be seen to this day the figure of Indra's wife, Indrani, sitting with her infant sun god, pointing the finger to heaven with the same gesture as the Italian Madonna and Child. In pagan and Christian symbolism, the author gives a figure from a medieval woodcut, the like of which we have seen by dozens in old psalters, in which the Virgin Mary with her infant is represented as the Queen of Heaven on the crescent moon, emblem of virginity. Being before the sun, she almost eclipses its light. Then this, nothing could more completely identify the Christian mother and child with Isis and Horus, Ishtar, Venus, Juno, and a host of other pagan goddesses who have been called Queen of Heaven, Queen of the Universe, Mother of God, Spouse of God, the Celestial Virgin, the Heavenly Peacemaker, etc. Such pictures are not purely astronomical. They represent the male god and the female goddess as the sun and moon in conjunction, the union of the triad with the unit. The horns of the cow on the head of Isis have the same significance. And so, above, below, outside and inside the Christian church, in the priestly garments and the religious rites, we recognize the stamp of exoteric heathenism. On no subject within the wide range of human knowledge has the world been more blinded or deceived with such persistent misrepresentation as on that of antiquity. Its hoary past and its religious faiths have been misrepresented and trampled under the feet of its successors. Its hierophants and prophets, Miste and Apopte of the once sacred Adida of the temple, shown as demoniacs and devil worshippers, donned in the despoiled garments of the victim. The Christian priest now anathematizes the latter with rites and ceremonies which he has learned from the theurgists themselves. The Mosaic Bible is used as a weapon against the people who furnished it. The heathen philosopher is cursed under the very roof which has witnessed his initiation. And the monkey of God, i.e. the devil of Tertullian, the originator and founder of magical theurgy, the science of illusions and lies, whose father and author is the demon, is exorcised with holy water by the hand which holds the identical lituus with which the ancient augur, often a solemn prayer, used to determine the regions of heaven and evoke in the name of the highest the minor god, now termed the devil, who unveiled to his eyes futurity and has enabled him to prophesy. On the part of the Christians and the clergy, it is nothing but shameful ignorance, prejudice, and that contemptible pride so boldly denounced by one of their own reverend ministers, T. Gross, which rails against all investigation as a useless or criminal labor when it must be feared that they will result in the overthrow of pre-established systems of faith. On the part of the scholars, it is the same apprehension of the possible necessity of having to modify some of their erroneously established theories of science. Nothing but such pitiable prejudice, says Gross, can have thus misrepresented the theology of heathenism and distorted, nay caricatured, its forms of religious worship. It is time that posterity should raise its voice in vindication of violated truth, and that the present age should learn a little of that common sense of which it boasts, with as much self-complacency as if the prerogative of reason was the birthright only of modern times. The mysteries are as old as the world, and one well versed in the esoteric mythologies of various nations can trace them back to the days of the ante-Vedic period. The mysteries themselves were composed of two parts, the lesser at Agre and the higher ones at Eleusinia. It is positively absurd to judge the ancients from our own standpoint of propriety and virtue. And most assuredly it is not for the Church, which now stands accused by all the modern symbologists of having adopted precisely these same emblems in their coarsest aspect, and feels herself powerless to refute the accusations, to throw the stone at those who were her models. When men like Pythagoras, Plato, and Iamblichus, renowned for their severe morality, took part in the mysteries and spoke of them with veneration, it ill behooves our modern critics to judge them so rashly upon their merely external aspects. Iamblichus explains the worst, and his explanation for an unprejudiced mind ought to be perfectly plausible. Exhibitions of this kind, he says, in the mysteries were designated to free us from licentious passions by gratifying the sight and at the same time vanquishing all evil thought through the awful sanctity with which these rites were accompanied. The wisest and best men in the pagan world, adds Dr. Warburton, are unanimous in this, that the mysteries were instituted pure and proposed the noblest ends by the worthiest means. In these celebrated rites, although persons of both sexes and all classes were allowed to take a part, and a participation in them was even obligatory, very few indeed attained to the higher and final initiation. The gradation of the mysteries is given us by Proclus in the 4th book of his Theology of Plato. The perfective rite proceeds in order: the initiation, musis, and the initiation, epopteia, or the final apocalypse or revelation. Theon of Smyrna in Mathematica also divides the mystic rites into 5 parts. The first of which is the previous purification, for neither are the mysteries communicated to all who are unwilling to receive them. There are certain persons who are prevented by the voice of the crier, since it is necessary. The third part is denominated epopteia or reception, and the fourth, which is the end and design of the revelation, is the binding of the head and fixing of the crowns. Whether after this he, the initiated person, becomes an hierophant or sustains some other part of the sacerdotal office, but in the fifth, which is produced from all these, is friendship and interior communion with God. And this was the last and most awful of the mysteries. One need not go very deep into the literature of the Orientalists to become convinced that in most cases they do not even suspect that in the arcane philosophy of India there are depths which they have not sounded and cannot sound, for they pass on without perceiving them. There is a pervading tone of conscious superiority, a ring of contempt in the treatment of Hindu metaphysics, as though the European mind is alone enlightened enough to polish the rough diamond of the old Sanskrit writers and separate right from wrong for the benefit of their descendants. We see them disputing over the external forms of expression without a conception of the great vital truths these hide from the profane view. All that exists, says the Atharva Veda, is in the power of the gods. The gods are under the power of magical conjurations. The magical conjurations are under the control of the Brahmins, hence the gods are in the power of the Brahmins. This is logical, albeit seemingly paradoxical, and it is the fact. And this fact will explain to those who have not hitherto had the clue, among them Jacolia must be numbered, as will appear on reading his works, why the fakirs should be confined to the first or lowest degree of that course of initiation, whose highest adepts, or hierophants, are the sannyasis, or members of the ancient Supreme Council of 70. Bearing in mind that the Christian fathers have always claimed for themselves and their saints the name of friends of God, and knowing that they borrowed in this expression, with many others, from the technology of the pagan temples, it is but natural to expect them to show an evil temper whenever alluding to these rites. Ignorant as a rule, and having had biographers as ignorant as themselves, we could not well expect them to find the accounts of their beatific visions as a descriptive beauty, such as we find in the pagan classics. Whatever is on earth is the resemblance and shadow of something that is in the sphere, while that resplendent thing, the prototype of the soul spirit, remaineth in unchangeable condition. It is well also with its shadow. But when this resplendent one removeth far from its shadow, life removeth from the latter to a distance, and yet that very light is the shadow of something still more resplendent than itself. Thus speaks Desatir, the Persian book of Shet, thereby showing its identity of esoteric doctrines with those of the Greek philosophers. The Aum, A-U-M, contains the evocation of the Vedic triad, the Trimurti Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, say the Orientalists. It contains the evocation of something more real and objective than this triune abstraction. We say, respectfully contradicting the eminent scientists, it is the trinity of man himself on his way to become immortal through the solemn union of his inner triune self, the exterior gross body, the husk not even being taken in consideration as human trinity. It is when this trinity, in anticipation of the final triumphant reunion beyond the gates of corporeal death, became for a few seconds a unity, that the candidate is allowed at the moment of the initiation to behold his future self. Thus we read in the Persian Desatir of the resplendent one, in the Greek philosopher initiates of the Aguides, the self-shining, blessed vision resident in the pure light. In Porphyry, that Plotinus was united to his God 6 times during his lifetime, and so on. In ancient India, the mystery of the triad, known but to the initiates, could not, under the penalty of death, be revealed to the vulgar, says Viraspati. Neither could it in the ancient Grecian and Samothracian mysteries, nor can it be now. It is in the hands of the adepts and must remain a mystery to the world so long as the materialistic savant regards it as an undemonstrated fallacy, an insane hallucination, and the dogmatic theologian, a snare of the evil one. This word, absorbed when it is proved that the Hindus and Buddhists believe in the immortality of the spirit, must necessarily mean intimate union, not annihilation. Let Christians call them idolaters, if they still dare do so, in the face of science and the latest translations of the sacred Sanskrit books. They have no right to present the speculative philosophy of ancient sages as an inconsistency, and the philosophers themselves as illogical fools. With far better reason, we can accuse the ancient Jews of utter nihilism. There is not a word contained in the books of Moses, or the prophets either, which, taken literally, implies the spirit's immortality. Yet every devout Jew hopes as well to be gathered into the bosom of Abraham. The Hierophants and some Brahmins are accused of having administered to their apoptites strong drinks or anesthetics to produce visions which shall be taken by the latter as realities. They did and do use sacred beverages which, like the soma drink, possess the faculty of freeing the astral form from the bonds of matter. But in those visions there is as little to be attributed to hallucination as in the glimpses which the scientist, by the help of his optical instrument, gets into the microscopic world. A man cannot perceive, touch, and converse with pure spirit through any of his bodily senses. Only spirit alone can talk to and see spirit. And even our astral soul, the doppelganger, is too gross, too much tainted, yet with earthly matter, to trust entirely to its perceptions and insinuations. The reason why in every age so little has been generally known of the mysteries of initiation is twofold. The first has already been explained by more than one author and lies in the terrible penalty following the least indiscretion. The second is the superhuman difficulties and even dangers which the daring candidate of old had to encounter, and either conquer or die in the attempt when, what is still worse, he did not lose his reason. There was no real danger to him, whose mind had become thoroughly spiritualized and so prepared for every terrific sight. He who fully recognized the power of his immortal spirit and never doubted for one moment its omnipotent protection had naught to fear. But woe to the candidate in whom the slightest physical fear, sickly child of matter, made him lose sight and faith in his own invulnerability. He who was not wholly confident of his moral fitness to accept the burden of these tremendous secrets was doomed. It is not the pure at heart, and he who studies but with a view to perfecting himself and so more easily acquiring the promised immortality, who need have any fear, but rather he who makes of the science of sciences a sinful pretext for worldly motives, who should tremble. The latter will never withstand the Kabbalistic evocations of the supreme initiation. In burning the works of the theurgists, in proscribing those who affect their study, and affixing the stigma of demonolatry to magic in general, Rome has left her exoteric worship and Bible to be helplessly riddled by every free thinker, her sexual emblems to be identified with coarseness, and her priests to unwittingly turn magicians and even sorcerers in their exorcisms, which are but necromantic evocations. Thus, retribution, by the exquisite adjustment of divine law, is made to overtake this scheme of cruelty, injustice, and bigotry through her own suicidal acts. True philosophy and divine truth are convertible terms. A religion which dreads the light cannot be a religion based on neither truth or philosophy. Hence, it must be false. The ancient mysteries were mysteries to the profane only, whom the Hierophant never sought nor would accept as proselytes. To the initiates, the mysteries became explained as soon as the final veil was withdrawn. No mind like that of Pythagoras or Plato would have contented itself with an unfathomable and incomprehensible mystery like that of the Christian dogma. There can be but one truth, for two small truths on the same subject can but constitute one great error. Among thousands of exoteric or popular conflicting religions which have been propagated since the days when the first men were enabled to interchange their ideas, not a nation, not a people, nor the most abject tribe, but after their own fashion has believed in an unseen God, the first cause of unerring and immutable laws, and in the immortality of our spirit. No creed, no false philosophy, no religious exaggerations could ever destroy that feeling. It must therefore be based upon an absolute truth. On the other hand, every one of the numberless religions and religious sects views the deity after its own fashion. And fathering on the unknown its own speculations, it enforces these purely human outgrowths of overheated imagination on the ignorant masses and calls them revelation. As the dogmas of every religion and sect often differ radically, they cannot be true. And if untrue, what are they? The real meaning of the word nazar signifies to vow or consecrate oneself to the service of God. As a noun, it is a diadem or emblem of such consecration, a head so consecrated. Joseph was styled a nazar. The head of Joseph, the vertex of the nazar among his brethren. Samson and Samuel, Semison and Sembael, are described alike as nazars. Porphyry, treating of Pythagoras, says that he was purified and initiated at Babylon by Zaradas, the head of the sacred college. May it not be surmised, therefore, that the Zoroaster was the Nazar of Ishtar? Zaradas or Nazarad being the same with change of idiom? Ezra was a priest and scribe, a hierophant, and the first Hebrew colonizer of Judea was Zerubbabel, or the Zorro, or Nazar, of Babylon. Here the author quotes Ezekiel from the Bible, from chapter 8. And there stood 70 men of the senators of the house of Israel. Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients do in the dark? Inquires the Lord. At the door of the house of the Lord, behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz, Adonis. We really cannot suppose that the pagans have ever surpassed the chosen people in certain shameful abominations of which their own prophets accuse them so profusely. To admit this truth, one hardly needs even to be a Hebrew scholar. Let him read the Bible in English and meditate over the language of the holy prophets. The motive of Jesus was evidently like that of Gautama Buddha, to benefit humanity at large by producing a religious reform, which should give it a religion of pure ethics, the true knowledge of God and nature having remained, until then, solely in the hands of the esoteric sects and their adepts. As Jesus used oil and the Essenes never used aught but pure water, he cannot be called a strict Essene. On the other hand, the Essenes were also set apart. They were healers, asaya, and dwelt in the desert as all ascetics did. The Christians were universally called Nazareans and Essenes, according to Epiphanius. Let me give you the spellings there. Nazoraens and Iessaeans. And since the author is pointing out that that was the name of Christians, Iessaeans, let it be known, as the case may be, that Jesus was known in India as Issa. And bear in mind also the similarity that word has to, of course, Isis. And followers of hers, as they're known today, are in some other times Issians.